So Botswana is interesting because it's talked about by many people as being a good example of leadership in Africa. And we're going to go through some of the reasons why people say that. Both the West Africans, various people say it. But there are, like all countries, there's some challenges and interesting things. What can we learn from it? Because it's got a very, very small population for its land size. And it's got the benefit of having diamonds. So, but then again, you've had other countries in Africa that had the benefit of oil and the benefit of loads of resources, but they have basket cases for leadership or for governance. So let's have a look. Let's go through some stuff. So what we do every week, these are the things that we look at. We have some reflections. We're always reflecting on leadership. Everything I say is we're looking at in that context, but what have the leaders actually done with the resources that they've had in front of them? We look at that whole independence period, although there's not much to talk about in terms of Botswana. It's really what happened afterwards, but we will touch on that as well. We'll look at how the leaders have developed the country or not, as the case may be. And we will look at macroeconomic performance. So we're going to look at some of that. And, you know, moral and development ideologies, although it's not a big emphasis in Botswana around ideologies because of that history. We will look at a range of national policies, good or bad, and its impact on its people. And, you know, and of course, it's to promote the wider agenda of African leadership. So this is what we've used so far. We've looked at things that from the Mo Ibrahim Prize in African leadership, looking at things like democracy and human rights, sustainable and equitable prosperity, because sustainable is one thing, but equitable is another. There's a lot of countries in the world that got wealth and it's sustainable, but it's not equitable. So there's a lot of poverty, especially in Africa. Is there exceptional role models? And the thing is, Botswana is probably closer to, there's a book called Good to Great. I don't know if people have ever heard of that book, Good to Great. It's more a book if you know about business. And basically, the author of that book, Jim Collins, I believe it's Jim Collins, he did research into businesses over a 30-year period, looking at from a leadership point of view, and identified the key traits of great leaders in business. And this is sort of what you would, the equivalent of sort of FTSE 100 in England, in the US, of consistent performance over time. And what he demonstrated, that a lot of those best examples were people that hardly anybody's heard of. And Botswana, I think, is a kind of an example where if you had to name a Botswanan leader, most people, we said, right, name one, you'd struggle to name one. So it is interesting. Oh, somebody's read the book as well. It is Jim Collins. Yeah, great book. Yeah, Good to Great. Really good book. But he talks about leadership can be very subtle, and some of the best leaders, they're not well known. They're not particularly public figures. They're quiet leaders who lead from behind. And maybe Botswana is a good example of that, but we'll come back to that anyway. So we'll look at a little bit about regional integration, but again, I find it quite difficult to find information about it. And it may be because, again, Botswana are not big on the sort of political landscape. You know, leaders who make loads of speeches are really good at social media, have a very good media machine. Like when I looked at somewhere like Rwanda, for example, because the way that they govern, because it's very modern, they're very tech savvy, there's loads of information about what they're doing. So they publicize everything. They put everything on the internet. So it makes it very easy to look into a country. And partly it's good governance anyway, because part of good governance is being public, you know, letting people know what's going on. How easy is it for people to know what's going on? So it's quite interesting. So what else? I added a few around corruption. Interesting, because Botswana, I think, is the least corrupt in Africa. We'll come back to that one. Well, of course, we've got to look at the role of women. So I've got a couple of slides where I specifically look at that. Of course, we've got slides that look at the economy in some detail, and not massive on institutions, but I've got enough to understand that institutions in Botswana are pretty strong. Pan-African direction is a little bit difficult. Maybe we can have a conversation about that, see what they say about that. Plans for succession, well, they've got a very good history up there. So this is what we've done so far. Amazingly, how far we've come. And so 5 sessions in. Ethiopia, massive topic last week, huge population. We've got such a contrast this week with Botswana. and the last one's going to be South Sudan. I took off the good, the stuff around, you know, happiness index, because I'm not convinced that how useful it is. So I couldn't justify the source on that, so I didn't want to keep using it, so I've taken it off. Right, just this was just to demonstrate, it's not specific to any country, but just to demonstrate that Africa is not a basket case, that Africa is moving forward, has accepted the Millennium Development Goals from the UN, which are universal goals around human development, and Africa has been making some strides in some areas. Primary school enrollment is one of them, an improvement in education. Gender equality is also a strength in Africa, is consistently improving. And this is interesting because we don't often really look at these things. We can be very self-critical, but if you look at India compared to Africa in terms of how many women are in politics, even though, you know, Gandhi, I've forgotten her name now, but was it his wife or daughter? I can't quite remember. But anyway, there's been, you know, there has been leaders in Africa, in India. But Sonia Gandhi is a bit controversial because Sonia Gandhi is European. So there's a little bit controversial about when she came to power, she didn't actually take her position. She let others do it because of that whole contradiction of her being a European, but she's just there in name. But if you look at countries like India, Pakistan, and quite a lot of parts of Asia, there's still sexism in terms of women in high positions, women in politics. It's not that great. And if you look at the problems like rape and the way women are treated in places like India, it's horrendous. And we don't have that. Indira Gandhi, that's it. Thank you very much. No, there's always somebody concentrating. At least I know you're all listening. But if you look at gender equality across a lot of Asia, and of course the Middle East, not great story. So again, but we'll look at that again in Botswana's context as well. So we'll come back to that. Malaria, HIV and AIDS, well, that's an interesting one in Botswana. When you come to healthcare, that's an interesting story. So we'll come back to that one as well. But generally, reductions in under 5 mortality has been good in Africa, and we've been improving faster than most places. Okay, and the whole campaign to try and reduce the impact of mosquitoes has been good as well. So let's get on to Botswana, because that's what we're really here to talk about. And let me just move this. I've got a little bit of the Zoom information in my way. So I'm just going to move it down the screen. See if I can move it out of the way. I can only move it so low. I was just seeing if there was a chat come up. No. Okay. So let's hit Botswana. So look at the contrast here. We've got a huge difference between the countries couple of countries we've looked at recently, with the exception of Rwanda, but with Ghana having a large population, you know, around the 40 million mark. And then last week with Ethiopia over 100 million. And now we have, if you look at the size here. There's not a massive difference between Botswana and Ethiopia. If you look at the size of Ethiopia, if you look at the far eastern horn, what we call the Horn of Africa, because Africa looks like a head. And if you look at the Horn of Africa where looks like a rhino's horn, that's where Ethiopia is. There's not a massive difference in size between Ethiopia and Botswana. So Botswana has a tiny population, 2.2 million, which is smaller than London. You know, it's like the population of Birmingham. It's a whole country and it's a huge landmass. Somebody's asked already about how significant it is that Botswana is a republic. Well, it's not that significant in the sense that most African countries are now republics, which basically means they have a president and the head of state is not the queen. So symbolically, it's very significant because having the queen as the head of state, of course, is a contradiction, because it does mean you have some countries like in the Caribbean where the queen is still head of state and they have prime ministers, not a president. But what it does mean is there's a few issues around the Privy Council and some structural things where the British state still has a say over the death penalties and some aspects of the legal system, because the constitutional power, there's still a little bit in Britain. So if you're an independent nation, you really want to be a republic where you don't have the British state as head of state, the Queen as the head of state. And also where some European countries have become republics is because they used to have monarchies. Africa has not really had many monarchies. So when I say not had many monarchies, I mean in terms of modern history, having monarchies running the country like Ethiopia. So Ethiopia had a monarchy as the emperor in power up until the 70s. There isn't a, I can't think of anywhere apart from Lesotho or somewhere like that would have a king running the country, but they're very small countries with almost insignificant population sizes in Africa to say they're significant. So basically Ethiopia was the most significant place with a large population to have a head of state that was actually a constitutional monarch, not unelected constitutional monarch, until Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974, what we did last week. So it's not a major thing being a republic in that context, but it's still significant because you have a president of Botswana and not the queen as the head of state of Botswana. So that is quite significant. So 70% of Botswana is actually desert, or what you would call sort of the Kalahari Desert, a large parts of it. So if you look at them, a lot of the names on this map, they're around the coast, not the coast, around the edge of the country. And even the capital, that's quite interesting history when we go back. I'll tell you why the capital is so close to South Africa, which is kind of interesting as well. Right, let's keep going. A little bit of history. So during the scramble for Africa, the territory of Botswana was fought over by Germany and Britain. That part of the world, like Namibia, similar contradiction there around the Germans. So as I said, don't let any Europeans say that these countries weren't involved in the scramble for Africa, because they certainly were. So during the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885, Britain annexed Botswana, because Britain was the superpower at the Berlin Conference anyway and had the biggest say. So they annexed Botswana into certain territories that became to known as modern Botswana. But as we know, over the years, territories have changed slightly, and the Western powers, or the Europeans basically who colonized Africa, had changed some of the territories just because of their own convenience, and partly because of the struggles we've had to say we're not happy with the structures that they've created. But the structures are basically created at the Berlin Conference by Europeans deciding on these population or the geographical structures of African countries. So that's a historical legacy. So in order to safeguard the road to the north and connect to the Cape Colony, to its territories further north, that's basically why it annexed it. So this is what I'm saying about, they just make decisions just based on, as I said, it could be just as simple as that, just to secure a road, to secure access to a lake, to secure access to other forms of transport, to secure a coastline, could be anything, but it's not going to be to improve the lives of African people. So that's the big contradiction. And then other territories were annexed and different things happened. I mean, the detail here is not major. It's just to show that these areas, they get messed around. And as I said, it's got nothing to do with what's best for us. So Britain, and it said, convinced the chiefs to accept British rule. Now, I don't know about you, but when you say convinced, what are we talking about here? The chiefs, what power did they have? And what power did Britain have? Britain was an empire with a powerful army, the most powerful army in the world, with the biggest empire in the world, negotiating with chiefs in Botswana. What power did they have? So when we say convince them, I'm not sure they had much choice but to accept British rule anyway. They couldn't say no. It's a bit like the mafia, isn't it? When they offer you an envelope or a choice, it's basically there's no choice. And it later became a protectorate to the British South African Company. Now, we've mentioned this before. Now, why is this significant? Now, why is it significant? Because basically, Western countries dominated the world through two things: arms or military and business. And they've always gone hand in hand. I spoke about before that the Queen of England, the previous queens of England and Europe, kings and queens of Europe, sponsored pirates and soldiers and other people to go around the world, basically sacking countries and basically exploiting resources, taking resources from the world. And they did it with the help of their own armies, but they also sponsored, so you could be sponsored as a pirate. Could you imagine the government today sponsoring your boat? As a group of us, we just go out there, gangsters, and the government gives us a license to go into any country and sack the government, or just basically steal resources from the country, and we just share it with the Queen or the King. So they don't kill us and they don't do anything bad to us, and we just do the dirty work for them. So this is kind of a history of it. So when we say a protectorate, look, this is basically saying that this country and the resources of this country can be used by the British company called the British South Africa Company. We saw this when we did South Africa, Azania South Africa, right at the start of this, that nearly all these colonized nations, the same thing: guns, business, business, guns. They go together. And you see the same with America as the leading superpower and imperialist power around the world, that where America has invaded practically every country in the world, practically every country in the world outside of Europe. And at some point or another, have had a fight with nearly everybody and stolen resources or influenced or changed governments or got more favorable trading conditions. And it's always about the same thing: political power and economic power. It's how they dominate the world. Because the fundamental aspect of imperialism is taking over somebody else's territory and using their resources for your own benefit. And that's basically what it is. So you need a strong military and you need economic businesses or companies to go in on your behalf and share the wealth with you. So in 1964, it took as long as 1964, and I'm not aware of a struggle. Of course, there was an anti-colonial struggle, but what I mean is I'm not aware of any armed struggle or any other. When I tried to look at the history of this, I saw no evidence of any armed struggle. It seemed to be a negotiated settlement. Now, if you understand Botswana, how I understand history, history has an answer to most things. If we haven't got it in a book, how do we analyze things? Now, we look historically, you know, Malcolm X said history is a weapon for the oppressed, you know. We look at history and say, well, hang on. Countries that had a big fight for their independence, there's only two reasons you're going to have a big fight. One, the arrogance of the imperial power. And two, because you have something they want that they're not going to give up. But countries that don't seem to have much resources have very little resistance when countries want independence. So places like Singapore, for example, in Asia, Botswana in Africa, some countries like Gambia and certain places, they just don't have a military struggle because it's perceived as not having great resources, perceived as not having a great amount of labor, and therefore independent struggles are much easier to fought. In comparison to South Africa, where it had huge resources, look at the fight there. And if we looked at countries like Angola, Mozambique, places like that where there was huge military struggles to try and get independence, we see the comparison to other countries. So even when we did Ghana, there was no military struggle as such. It was just a positive action campaign, a negotiation. So it depends on the context and the timing of how these happen. But certainly it didn't look like there was any serious struggle to get independence in Botswana. And because I don't think they had any major resources that England wanted, except diamonds. And we'll come back to that shortly. And the diamonds were owned by a private company. So that was also another factor. It wasn't owned by the British state. So it didn't have that big vested interest in Botswana. And we were a very small population as well. So, as I said, the United Kingdom accepted proposals for democratic self-government in Botswana, and they moved towards elections. I'm just going to move out of the way. Let's move this bar out of the way. And move to democratic elections. Well, one of the things that was interesting, I forgot to mention, it's a good thing I just put it on here. The government of Botswana was actually run from South Africa. It's really peculiar, this. And it just shows how insignificant Botswana was to the British state, that the British government or government-controlled, what do you call it, colonial, offices were based in South Africa. And it's no surprise that the government of Botswana today, and what's the state capital, Gaborone, is right on the border of South Africa, which is really interesting, which I didn't appreciate or understand the significance of that at the time. But now I realize that the reason is because it was so close to South Africa, and South Africa was the home of the government before. It's no surprise that the government was formed so close. Although you could argue, why did they do that? Didn't they move it right in the middle? So it was far away and without the influence of South Africa. But anyway, that's the history. Let's just move on. It is the oldest continuous democracy in Africa. And I think that is a legacy worth mentioning. And when I say the oldest continuous democracy, what I mean without coups, without military rule. So you've had democracies in Ghana, you've had democracies in Nigeria who were over a longer period of time since Ghana's independence, but it hasn't been continuous democracy. So Ghana's had military coups, and it's had military governments when Rawlings was in, for example, for periods of time. So democracy in Ghana, in terms of continuous democracy, is relatively more recently. In the late 80s, 90s is when that became more common. So only in the last 30 years, you could say, in Ghana. Nigeria had military rule only in the 1980s as well, you know. So again, not continuous democracy. So it's interesting. So Botswana adopted its name after becoming independent, and within the Commonwealth, it's part of the Commonwealth in the '66, and they had a consistent record of uninterrupted democratic elections. So every 5 years they've had elections, and they've just had that every single time. But it's interesting. I'll come back to that actually. The lowest perceived corruption ranking in Africa since at least the late 1980s, 90s. So that's interesting as well. Lowest perceived corruption. So that's by the people, by, you know, how people perceive Botswana, the people themselves. Very, very low levels of corruption. And everywhere you look, everything you look at, it says the same. The corruption is very low. You all right, Nigel?
Yeah, I'm all right.
You've unmuted?
Yeah, everything is good. Enjoying the lecture so far.
Okay, good, good. I thought you wanted to say something.
No. Sorry, I just accidentally pressed unmute.
No problem. So yes, lowest corruption. So that's I think that's a great legacy. So if you look at leadership, one of the biggest consistent issues we've seen with all the countries we've looked at so far, and I think it's going to be interesting with South Sudan, corruption is probably one of the single biggest issues that keeps a country poor. You know, massive corruption means the country is not developing, means that, you know, constant economic development is interrupted by money being siphoned off to all different people around the country rather than the people themselves. So we consistently see countries that have low levels of corruption and good governance, the little money that they may have is used more constructively in the country and consistently constructively in the country. And this is the story in Botswana, no surprise. One of the most sparsely populated countries in the world, as I said, because the size of the country is huge. If I check it on a map, I didn't actually check it in comparison to Europe, but I think Botswana is bigger than France. And you think France has a population of what, 70 million or something? Germany is even smaller, has a population of about 80 million. And Botswana is of that size, if not bigger, and a population of 2 million, which is a small city in most Western countries, isn't it? 2.2 million. In most countries around, in fact, most countries around the world, that's not even considered that big a city. As I said, I think Birmingham has a population of about 2 million. And I think Manchester may be around 1 million. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it just shows that we're talking small, relatively speaking, compared to countries around the world. I just got a question here. Why are Westerners often insisting on the overpopulation of Africa when clearly many countries have low population density? Ah, you've got me into a controversial issue here. Can't help but deal with this one. Now, yes, well, to answer the question, so-called Western people have raised concerns about populations in Africa because of the levels of poverty. And in some parts of Africa, the populations are enormous, like in Ethiopia and Nigeria. So if you look at the poverty in Ethiopia and Nigeria, the two big, most populous countries, population is an issue. Now, I know this is a sensitive issue, but one of the things we have to be careful of is we need to have an African perspective on Africa, irrespective of what Europeans say. Even if they say it, we shouldn't react because they say it, we'd automatically disagree. So we have to be careful with that one. So for example, when I used to go to early days in African Liberation Day, we were all asked to wear white. You know, the AAPRP always said we wear white to African Liberation Day. And a lot of our people in England, in the West, complained, oh, why do we have to wear white? Why are we wearing white? Why don't we wear black? Because, you know, black people, we should wear black, not white. But that's a reaction because we live in the West. But if you're in Africa, where the party was born in places like Ghana and Guinea, for example, when Guinea have African Liberation Day, everybody turns up in white. Because in Africa, white is, you know, white is, cotton is white, linen is white. So it's normal to have white clothes for special occasions, right? But because we live in the West and we think, oh, Ku Klux Klan and we get all that, we allow other people who come after us to steal things from us. And then we don't want to do what is our history because we think, oh, white is symbolic of Ku Klux Klan. So why are we wearing white to African Liberation Day? But if white is our thing, is our history and our culture, we must reclaim it and say, no, we want to wear what we traditionally wear. Now, when it comes to the population issue, why I think this is a huge issue is that, let's put it as simple as this. If you met me and I was struggling financially, myself and my wife were struggling financially, and every time you met me, I said I'm struggling. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. And every time you met me, I had more children. What would you say? Would you say to me, oh, it's a conspiracy of Europeans, why he shouldn't have children? Or would you say privately, you might not say it to me, but would you say privately, why does he keep having so much children? If he's always saying he hasn't got any money, why does he keep having so much children? He's got 8 children, he's still having more children, and he's got no money. He's always saying can't afford stuff. His children looking a little bit rough. They haven't got shoes and stuff like that. Now, in Africa, you could argue the same thing. It's not as simple. I accept it's not as simple because it's a country we're talking about, not a family. But in principle, if you're the government in Africa and your population, women are having children, an average of say 6 to 8 children each, and most families are absolutely in poverty, why would you not want to reduce the number of children that these women are having? Because it is a massive contribution to poverty, having large number of children, because people do struggle to bring them up. Now, there's why I mention it in a slightly different way is it's not just about children. It's about a wide number of things. Economic development. We talked about this last week when we talked about Ethiopia. The secret to population control from a progressive point of view is not population control. This is why dialectics is so important, the concept of dialectics, okay? It's not logic, dialectics. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily look at a problem directly. Sometimes a problem is better resolved by doing something separately, okay? It's indirect consequences. So if you want to reduce the population or the number of children born at young ages, there's a number of things you've got to do. One, like in Ethiopia, you have to try to address the sexist situation where children are married, girls are married very young. So girls that are married into their teens and very young to older men are likely to be exploitable anyway, because these women are going to be not particularly well educated or not educated at all. They don't have a job. They're not going to have a career, and they're totally under the control of the men, especially if you live in rural areas where you don't have cars, you don't have access to multiple jobs. So it's a very oppressive situation. So one of the first things we have to do is make sure girls go to school right up to 16 minimum and encourage girls to have careers and go to university and have future, job prospects. That alone, with free birth control, will predominantly lower population sizes anyway. If you look at China, for example, and I'm laboring on this just for a minute, just because I think it is significant, because it does come up so often. If you look at China, they had the world one-child policy. Why did they do that? They didn't do it just because they wanted to be cruel to their own people. They had a one-child policy because they were struggling to feed themselves. At one point, millions of people died in the 1950s or 60s. I can't remember. Yeah, the big famine in China. Over 10 million people died of starvation. Now, if you don't address population, how many more of your people will starve to death before you're going to start to address it? So that's why it's important to address it from such a multiple point of view. And the best way is to educate women and give women a great opportunities in life in your society. And that in itself lowers the birth of children. But we need to replace ourselves. But in places like Botswana, you could say you could have a policy to increase the population, because also a bigger population creates more economic benefits for the people as a whole. Somebody's come with a question. Let me just have a look at that one. I like the work of Gracia Michelle in Ethiopia on child marriage. That's interesting, yes. Because child marriage is a massive problem. And if we don't stop child marriage and make it illegal in Africa, because it's a practice in Africa, doesn't make it right, doesn't make it good. So child marriage is basically a negative, universally seen as a negative thing, because it's all about girls. Child marriage has never got anything to do with boys. It's always to do with girls. And it's normally older men who want these young children because they know they can exploit them. Okay, they can exploit them. It's not a problem with boys getting married young, is it? Boys are not getting married young. It's the girls that are getting married young. And it's also almost like a financial thing as well. just like we see the contradiction in other societies, we see it even in Western societies where a rich man like Rupert Murdoch will have a wife. You know, you'd be an 8-year-old decrepit man, but because you're a billionaire, you got a 25-year-old wife, and it's kind of like we all know it's like almost like a financial situation. And in Africa, it's the same thing. A middle-class man or a man with a little bit of money can virtually buy a child from the family by offering them money. And we've got to stop these things. Right, let's keep going. Let's get back to this. Formerly one of the poorest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita of $70 per year in the late 60s. Now, this is very significant. So Botswana, even though it's got a small population, was very poor at independence. So remember, it was 66. $70 per person per year. Per year, you know. Now, Botswana has transformed itself into an upper middle income country. Now, what does that look like? We'll come back to that in a second. What does that mean? Like, it's a huge transformation from $70. So remember the $70. So it's one of the world's fastest growing economies and has been for a while. Let's look at this success story. It is dominated by mining, cattle, and tourism. Now, this is one of the dangers in Botswana. Because when we look at the reason why well, I shouldn't necessarily say the word reason. One of the reasons why Botswana is doing so well economically is because Botswana did a great deal with the diamonds. And we're going to come back to that a bit later. But they did a great deal with the diamonds with the birds. So they get a big percentage. I'm not sure what the actual percentage is. I'll try and see if it's on here. Of the diamond wealth. But not just the diamond wealth as in the raw diamonds, but the finished article. And they've done a new negotiation back in 2012 that has made that even significantly, similarly better deal as well. And I'll come back to that later. So mining and cattle has never been a wealth creator, a huge wealth creator in countries around the world. If you look at countries around the world that you would call wealthy, they haven't done it through mining, because mining in its own context is raw material. Raw material, as I've said in previous weeks, doesn't make countries wealthy. Raw materials that are refined and made into a finished product makes countries wealthy. So you see countries that finish products and sell them as finished goods, like China, like Western countries, like all the Asian tigers, like all the countries that are booming right now, nearly all of the countries that are booming are selling finished goods. And those finished goods is where the real money is. So if you're going to mine anything and you're not making it into something refined, the price is always going to be lower than the people who refine it. So the refining is where all the profit is, not where the mining is. So Britain doesn't have to have any mines. America doesn't have to have any mines. As long as they get access to those materials cheap, similarly cattle, similarly all different processed food. It's the processing of the food and the packaging of the food where all the profit is. You know, if you get a fish, how much does a fish cost? They just send fish. But if you process that and sell it, even, as I said, even with food, and you put it into delicacies, put it in lovely packaging and all the rest of it, like prawns and all that, you charge a premium for it. Same with anything like cashew nuts, for example, a premium price in Britain, where you pay like £1 per 100 grams approximately, or even more, double that in some places. But when you get the raw cashew nuts in Africa, they're worth very little. But when they're processed into a product that can be sold, even though when I say process, it doesn't mean you're adding anything artificial to it. You might put the roasted ones, but even the raw ones, it's processed as in it's packaged nicely, put in a nice packet and then sold on. That's where the profit is. So have a look at this figure. This is mind-blowing, I think. Just have a look at this figure, seriously. I gave you the figure of $70 per person per year. And now, or it's probably higher than that, because I couldn't get any figure nearer than 2015. So in the last 5 years, I'm sure it's gone up. But let's say it's the same. $70 per person, and now Botswana wealth is nearly $19,000 per person in Botswana. That is, I don't even know what percentage growth that is. If I work that out in a calculator, it would be thousands of percent growth. Because it wasn't 700, it wasn't 7,000, it was 70. This is like thousands of percent growth. Phenomenal. So you would expect any country that could move that kind of wealth in 50 years, what's that, 50 years, just over 50 years, is going to be a country that's going to do pretty well unless it's horrendously corrupt. Okay, so and it's proven to be so, because as you see this unfolds, you see that Botswana and the people are relatively prosperous. Got another question coming. Just have a look at that. Ah, somebody said, "Wow, it is a wow. It's a real wow." That figure, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. It's one of the highest in Africa, and De Beers. This is the De Beers deal. Now, they'd signed this deal around independence, but they've revised this deal. Now, De Beers, anybody knows De Beers, one of the biggest diamond companies in the world. And the diamonds were taken from Botswana and refined in places like Britain and places like the Netherlands. But this deal in 2012, which is coming up for a renewal in 2 years' time, this 10-year deal with Botswana moved its rough stone sorting. Did you see that? Rough stone sorting. So even if you get a rough diamond, it's still worth a lot, but not as much as a refined diamond, which is now refined, moved from London to Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana. That's major, because now you're getting the benefit of the refined. But the problem with Botswana, whilst I say it's a good economic story, is that they're still very dependent on diamonds. Now, the problem with this is when the commodity price for diamonds falls, like it did during the recession around 2008, the income to the Botswanan government collapses with it. So that's a major risk. So if you have a commodity-based government income, you are very, very, very threatened by changes in what prices are worth. So if there's a major recession, which everybody's predicting at the end of this year, world recession, and diamond prices collapse, and when I say collapse, it's all relatively speaking. Say a diamond, I don't know, a carat is worth, I don't know what a carat is worth, but let's say a carat is worth £500. If that drops, if you're selling millions and millions and millions of these, and it drops even from 500 to 400, to you and me, that doesn't make much difference. A diamond in a ring that costs £1,000 is now 800. That's not making a lot of difference to the average person. But if you're a government and your income goes from 500 to a carat to 400 a carat, and you're doing millions of these, that's a 20% of your income could be collapsed in any 1 year. Now, if your income is 1 billion or whatever, losing 200 million in a year is a huge lot of money. So 20% of your income is huge. So if you lost 20% of your income in the next year, how significant would that be to you? Most people, that's a big hit, right? So there is that danger of it being too dependent. A high gross national income, the fourth in Africa, gives the country a relatively high standard of living. No surprise there, right? And it has the highest human development index. Now, the reason why I looked at this is because from an African point of view, we could say, so what? Why do we care what their GDP is if we don't know whether the people live decently? So the Human Development Index gives us an idea, which is commonly known as HDI, because it goes hand in hand. We want to know, is the economics leading to a better human existence? And it is. So it's the highest in sub-Saharan Africa. So therefore, it has led to a better quality of life. So Botswana is resource abundant. So, it's interesting that actually, because so they've got the money, but I'm not aware of any other major exports apart from tourism. And tourism can be also dangerous, because if we see with COVID-19, I know COVID isn't common, but other things can happen that can hit your tourism. And all you need is a little terrorist incident or something that goes on the news that makes people a bit nervous to go to your country. Somebody's kidnapped or somebody gets killed, or it can be quite volatile. And now with COVID-19, we can see many countries around the world, their tourism is really, really collapsed. If we look at even Spain, just by the government in Britain announcing that you've got to have 14-day quarantine, it is absolutely devastated tourism in Spain for the whole of this summer, because people have cancelled, are not going to book trips to Spain now, if you know anything about tourism in this country, we're talking millions of people go to Spain every year in this country. And that's millions of people spending, on average, probably 500 to £1,000 per person when they go on holiday. If you take that away from Spain, that's a huge hit. The benefit, of course, and we think it's political, is that they're going to spend that money in Britain. So it's quite interesting. That's why Spain complaining. So Botswana has tourist income, but that would also have been hit because there's been no flights, there's been no tourism this summer in all parts of the world. So it's an issue. So Botswana, one critique I would have is that I think they should diversify. They should use the wealth from the diamonds to build other industries that are almost recession proof. Things like IT industries is what places like Rwanda's doing, places like Ethiopia, educating the young people so they can develop businesses and jobs for themselves that make them less volatile to product price changes. So if everybody's in mining and tourism, and then you're commodity based, it hits you hard. If there's a much more diverse economy where there's industrialization, people are in all different sectors, it protects you from the world crisis. And also if you have a big service industry within your economy, which is what China's doing, looking at building a big service industry, by having a big service industry means it's predominantly propped up by your own people, by people who buy services within the country, whether it's IT, whether it's foods, whether it's drinks, whether it's restaurants, whether it's hotels, business, etc. So it protects you more from external shock. So if the internal economy is very strong and regionally it's very strong, it almost doesn't matter what's happening in Europe. So that's just something worth talking about. This at the bottom, it has a good institutional framework, which has allowed the country to reinvest its resource income in order to generate stable future income. So they do have good reserves as well. And we talked about one of the leadership qualities was, has it got sustainable institutions? Botswana, yes, has sustainable institutions. Look at this growth per year. Average over 9% per year for 33 years. That's why Botswana got where it got. Yeah, and that's 10 years later to that figure that we just mentioned. It was almost 16 years later, sorry. So phenomenal growth. If China consistently grew at around this percentage for 30 years, and look where China is now. Now, if Botswana had a population of 100 million and they grew at this size, they'd be a superpower now. They'd be one of the richest countries in the world because the population size would be so big that 9% growth. If you imagine per capita in Ethiopia was 18,000, because at the moment, I can't remember what the figure was from last week. I don't know. Can anybody remember the figure from last week, what the per capita figure for Ethiopia was? If it was 18,000, it'd be super rich, because 18,000 times 100 million people is phenomenal wealth. And that's why big populations are advantageous. That's why we talk about Pan-Africanism so much, because with 1.2 billion people times high GDP, we'd be a superpower. So that's why it's important to go big. That's why Botswana is not so significant in the world, because its economy, whilst it's strong per person, but because the economy, the population is so small, it's not a big economy, it's very small. Okay, so that's why it's not really that spoken about. There's high levels of economic freedom as well, one of the highest, if not the highest, in Africa. And what we mean by that, the ability to open business and to generate wealth and to run businesses. Because another big part of policy around the world, as countries have learned and found, is that if you have very repressive policies around land, so people's land goes missing, or, you know, when I say go missing, gets taken away by other people, that the integrity of policies, like you buy land and you come back and somebody's built a house on it and there's nothing you can do about it, that kind of thing destroys economic growth, because people won't want to risk money in your country, even your own people, if you turn around and somebody can build something on it and you can't do anything about it. Somebody just puts a factory on it or something. So land integrity and property integrity is a major part of economic development. And if you don't have freedom, so you open up a business and then the government just takes it over because of corruption and things like that, these are not economic freedom. And therefore it stifles the economy, because there's no incentive to do things, because you get to a certain size and the government just takes it over, or its cronies take it over from you. So it stifles economic growth. So freedom, economic freedom, is seen as a symbol of that. Very little foreign debt, which is another major factor. Most African countries have significant debt. And if you don't have debt, or you don't need debt, you also have economic freedom. We often talk about economic freedom for individuals. And what do we say? We have money in a way that means we are independent of somebody having to pay me a salary or me having to go to work. And independent income means I can do what I like. Relatively speaking, you can't go on Twitter and start criticizing certain people, even if you've got economic freedom. That might be a problem. And I think you know who I mean. But the point I'm making is that if you have independent income, and you don't rely on somebody else, nobody can dictate to you your policies. So if you don't have debt, the countries that don't have debt means nobody's telling them what to do. We saw the problem when we did Zimbabwe, didn't we? When we did Zimbabwe, we saw a massive problem because Zimbabwe took loans from the IMF and World Bank. They dictated what they did, which led to the economic crisis that they had, which has led to the problem we had today. And also because the economy of Zimbabwe, as I mentioned before, was so dependent on trading with countries like the West, that when they put sanctions on Zimbabwe because they didn't like what they did, it crippled the economy overnight. So these are really, really important factors. Negligible levels of foreign debt is a big thing. High sovereign credit rating. This is also, you hear this about countries, because if you have a high sovereign rating, it means it's easy to get loans. The government finds it easy to borrow, and also you borrow at the most favorable world rates. So in other words, not high interest. The more, because if you're poor, ironically, this is the capitalist system, but if you're poor and you try and get a loan or credit card, usually if you get a credit card, the interest rates are ridiculous. So you get a credit card and you'll get 35% interest or something crazy, or 100% interest, something crazy. If you're rich, you'll get very low interest because they see you as a low risk and you're more likely to pay it back. So that's the irony. When you're less likely to pay back a debt, they put more burden on you on it and more debt on it, which is ironic because they think the chance of you paying are lower, but it also makes it more difficult for you to pay it back. Their foreign exchange reserves, you see, this looks like peanuts. 7 billion looks like nothing, but because their population is so small, 7 billion in reserve is actually pretty good, right? Because it's the equivalent of 2.5 years of their current imports. So that means if Botswana had no income, right, or their income collapsed by a significant amount, their reserves could buy imports, all the imports they need, oil and other things, to keep the country running for 2.5 years without one single penny coming in. So that's like saying, if I lost my job tomorrow, lost my business, how long could you survive before you go, you're in financial crisis? Now, most people say you should be able to survive for at least 6 months. Most economic advisors would say this: you should be able to survive for at least 6 months if you had no money coming in. Now, most governments are like most people. You can't survive even for 1 month if you had no income coming in. Most people are in that situation where if you had no money coming in for 1 month, you would be in financial crisis. You couldn't pay your mortgage, couldn't pay your rent. And governments are no different. If you don't have reserves, which is basically savings, and there's an economic shock like COVID, your country goes into crisis and you have to borrow huge sums of money to keep the country going. And when you borrow huge sums of money, we come back to this problem with the debt management, and then people are controlling what you do. So Botswana says it's working hard to diversify its economy, although I don't know what that means exactly, because I couldn't see much evidence of what it means in terms of what they're actually doing to diversify the economy. But I take them on its word, given its good economic record, that it is trying to do this. But it still seems to me that diamonds are a huge part of their economy. So I think they've got some way to go on that. But given the situation they're in, they're probably in a very good position to move forward. So it also has the highest new business density. And that's really significant as well, because it means there's a high number of business registered per 1,000 people. It's again a way of indicating the economic likely future of a country. Just going to pause again, got a comment coming in. Let's have a look at the comment. Oh, that's interesting. How does a relatively small country or small nation like this stop the brain drain? I'm thinking of what happened in Malawi in the 90s and 2000s. Now, that's an interesting one, actually. But I think in Botswana, if you've got relative wealth where you can actually earn good money, you see, the main reason for the brain drain in Africa, the two main reasons, actually, I'll say 2 reasons, is political, stroke corruption, and the likely income. You see, people don't usually migrate in large numbers unless you're not earning the money you think you should earn. So the reason why there's more doctors in there's more Nigerian doctors in America than in Nigeria is because you can go to a Nigerian doctor, if they can get into America and get a job, can earn 100 grand a year. But in Nigeria, you might be working in hospitals, earning pittance, not only not earning much money, but with very little resources, a poor hospital with electricity going out and not enough resources. And that can be so frustrating. Can you imagine, even if you love your country, you're still struggling. If you're struggling at home and know that you could just move to America or move to another country and earn 100 grand a year and live in luxury and live in, you know, really comfortable, it's very tempting for many people to go and live in another country if you can earn that kind of money. Now, my assumption, I don't have the evidence to back this up, but I can, based on what I know from the information I've received, that if the average person in Botswana by the economy is worth about $19,000 per person, that's that. So how GDP works is the gross national product of a whole nation is the total wealth of a nation, and then you divide it by its population. That's the per capita. So that means that the average wealth creating of Botswana is $19,000 per person. So it usually gives you an indication that pay is pretty high in comparison to a country very low. Because when we looked at Ethiopia, we saw, I think their GDP per capita was something like 3,000, something like that. I don't know if somebody could check that for me whilst I'm on here. Therefore, per person, it's quite low. But look at the average income in Ethiopia. It was very, very low, right, per year. It's like a few $100 per month the average person was earning. But in Botswana, I would assume it's much higher because of the relative wealth of the country. So that's why I think there'll be less brain drain. And in Malawi, it's very poor. We haven't done Malawi as a case study, but I would, from all my understanding, if we looked at Malawi as a country, it's very poor. And therefore, it's middle class. However small the middle class is, if they feel they can earn good money somewhere else, it's very tempting for them to leave and earn better money. Even in Cuba, we see in places like Cuba, people leave, don't they? You know, if a Cuban doctor earns $20 a month in 2020, I mean, you have to be tempted. You know, it's only human to be a bit tempted that if you could get to America and you could earn 100,000, it's very tempted to do that. Even though $20 in Cuba is still worth a lot more than $20 in America, but it's not worth, you know, tens of thousands times more. You can't buy a house for $20. You could buy a house with $100,000. See the difference? So it's a difficult one, and Africa has to do more to improve the conditions of the people, so people don't want to leave. Why would you want to leave if you lived in a very nice country? How many people want to leave Britain? Most people who leave Britain leave for two reasons. Racism, I think, is a factor, because I do believe people leave because of racism. They want to live somewhere with less integrated, but also it's mainly economic. So if you look at the people who leave Britain, it's predominantly economic reasons. You know, it's mostly economic. Even when people, you see all the population in Spain, they haven't gone to Spain for economic reasons so much. It's mostly retirement because they want the sun. But if you see where most white people leave, British white people leave, they go to places like America, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, because it's high standard of living, and they might have family out there as well. But very few people, if you think of who leaves Britain, white people who leave Britain to go to live abroad in large numbers to a country where you don't earn much, doesn't happen. So another question. Somebody wants to leave and live somewhere in Africa. Yes, great idea. Just do it. Somebody gave me the GDP, 2,500. Yes, 2,500. So if you compare the two, so Ethiopia, 2,500 GDP per capita, and Botswana, 18,900. Now, if somebody puts that on a calculator, if you did that in, let's just quickly, let's have a quick calculation just to give you a live illustration. The government of Ethiopia, with 109 million people, if they had that extra money, they would have 17,400 more. So let's times that by 17,400. They would have something like a trillion. It's like a trillion more pounds. It'd be a phenomenally wealthy country, basically, if they had that per capita in somewhere like Ethiopia, because 100 million people with that kind of wealth, it'd be $1 trillion economy in Ethiopia. So that shows you the difference. Ethiopia would be one of the richest countries in the world. So Althea, if you want to leave, there's loads of great countries in Africa. Botswana may be worth visiting as well. Right, let's keep going. Lots to get through today. Now, I've got only one party has ruled. Now, this is quite common in countries that are quite prosperous, as I mentioned before. If you look at South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, many of these countries, they've had one party in power. Even though they say they're democracies, they've had one party in power since independence in most of these countries. And no surprise when I found out that although Botswana have had democracy for all these years, every 5 years there's an election, the same party wins every single time. So when we say democracy, it does make you wonder, either that government is fantastic, which it does look like they're pretty good, or you wonder, why is there only one party ruling for the whole time? I'm not against one party ruling, by the way, I have to say that, because it creates continuity and it creates long-term, it means you can have long-term vision. So there are advantages. I'm just going to get some water. So that one party rule is very interesting, but let's have a look. They have multi-partyism, and it's a democratic republic. They do have the president I've mentioned before, but it's accountable to parliament, just like in Britain, very similar kind of structure, except for, of course, the head of state here is the Queen. So the president there has power, but with the government and the parliament as well. So executive power is exercised by the government, and legislative power is with the government and the parliament. So still, things have to still go through parliament. Because if you look at even the president of the United States, apart from foreign policy and military decisions, the president of the United States cannot make laws. So all what he does, he has to get signed off by Congress and the Senate, otherwise he can't pass laws. Apart from military decisions where he can take America to war, or he can do foreign policy decisions, like he can put bans on countries like he did with the Muslims coming to there. He can have those kind of policies, like he can put sanctions on countries. So all that foreign policy he can do, but he can't have legislation, and it's the same here. Most recently, that was the 11th election in 2019. And as I said, consistently, but it's dominated by the Botswana Democratic Party, has won everything. But it's not corrupt. Judiciary is independent of the executive. Now, you might think, if you live in Britain and you've been born in Britain and you don't know anywhere else, you might think that's quite normal, that the judiciary is independent of the state. So in other words, the legal system in England sometimes makes decisions that the government doesn't like, and it can't do anything about it. It has to implement it, because you cannot sack a judge in Britain. Only another judge or judges or a council can sack judges. You can't retire a judge. So because you can't sack judges, means that you're not in the pocket of the politicians. Nigel, you've raised your hand. I don't know if that might have been an accident.
I have a question.
You got a question?
Yeah, I'm going to put it in the chat, actually.
All right, fire away. I'll pick it up when you put it in. So yeah, they have an independent judiciary. Many countries in Africa, many countries in Asia, many countries around the world do not have an independent judiciary. So the government, if you look at Russia, for example, they're not independent. They just make all kinds of decisions. They bankrupt people, take people to court and all kinds of stuff, because Putin basically has power over all kinds of aspects of society. So when you don't have power, it means at least the people can have some rights. So where the constitution says certain things, you can enforce them, because the government has to listen to the legal system, and the legal system is enforced by the civil service. But if you have a civil service and police and army and legal system that is dominated by the government, then when you have injustices against the government, there's nothing you can do. Oh, so what's the question on the issue of democracy? Do we have any figures on the voter turnout? Oh, no, I don't actually. That'll be an interesting one. Somebody may be able to look that up. What's the percentage of people who vote in Botswana? I don't know, actually. Yeah, that's true. That's an aspect of it. But there isn't also the aspect of democracy. It's not just how many people turn up, but also what's the rights of the people and how interested, because controversy can often make people vote in high numbers, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are happy. So if there's a perception like this election in America, for example, if there's a perception that it's close, higher people turn out. If there's a perception that one person's going to win quite easily, there tends to be a lower turnout. So there's different things that affect it, but I get what you mean. It would be useful to know. But they still have the death penalty, funny enough, by hanging, which is interesting. But again, they have a legal system, so it's not just the president just, saying somebody's got to die. Botswana is ranked 30th out of 167 states on democracy index, which is very high. Because you think 30th, is up there with so-called Western and European countries. So it's worth understanding that. So Transparency International, which is respected as a looks at corruption and transparency in government, it ranks it up there with places like Portugal and South Korea, which are seen as transparent countries. I'm not saying Portugal and South Korea are great countries, that's a different issue, but in terms of transparency, they're seen as pretty high. So 30th out of 167 states, pretty good. There's a but, and that was the but. There's a but I found. The indigenous San people, there's some contradiction over this, and I can't get to the bottom of it exactly, but there was a contradiction with the indigenous San people who were forcibly relocated from their land to reservations. And I don't really understand the justification of why that was done. And another controversial issue is AFRICOM. If you don't know about AFRICOM, Google it, look it up. AFRICOM is basically American imperialism in its worst form, which is basically America wants to have military bases in Africa. And generally the African Union has been opposed, a good reason too, opposed to America having bases in Africa. The only reason America wants bases in Africa is to control the people in Africa and to control who's in government. Why would they need troops in Africa? Why would they need a base there? That's the only reason. So generally, most progressive people in Africa, progressive Africans, are against any military bases, foreign military bases in Africa, any. Oh, somebody said the displacement of indigenous people could be related to conservation of wildlife. It's true, it could be, but forcibly relocated, yeah, we'd have to dig into it a bit more, because most people are forcibly relocated for development. So it's always controversial, but any country that's developing will do it. I mean, Britain does it, you know, for HS2, there's going to be people who are complaining, aren't they, that they're going to get their houses knocked down. And if Heathrow Airport, the second runway, the additional runway gets built, a whole load of houses will get knocked down. And again, it's always controversial because people always will say it's a bad thing. But if you think about it, you could never have a motorway, you could never have developed cities, or you could never develop anything if you don't displace people to do it. The question is not displacement on its own, it's what compensation and what was the state of what they left and what was the state of where they went. So maybe I could have done a bit more digging on that, but that might be one for you to do a bit of research to find out what is the condition of the indigenous San people. But from what I read, there was a lot of alcoholism and mental health amongst those people. And that normally gives you an indication that they're not happy. If you look at the indigenous people in Australia, the Aborigines, who have high levels of alcoholism and mental health, that is a sign of being mistreated and racism. So it doesn't sound good, but I'd have to do a bit more digging to find out a bit more. Let's have a look at another comment. Yeah, it sounds unfair given the size of the country. It does. Let's keep going. Still got quite a lot to get through, and the time's running fast on us. Southern African integration. Again, I could find not a lot of stuff on this, but what I did find is that, because I know SADC, or they call it SADC, the South African Development Council, I think it stands for. But basically, this part of Africa, the southern part of Africa where Botswana is, there's a group of nations just like East Africa, just like West Africa, just like North Africa, where they come together and trade. And it's relatively prosperous because South Africa is a major economy in that area. But the regional integration hasn't been particularly great. And there has been some criticism that South Africa hasn't done enough to use its weight to integrate. But as we know, ANC are not Pan-Africanists. So ANC have not really pushed the Pan-African agenda. So it's no surprise that it's not a major part of the South African government's priority. But there has been some recent talks with Zimbabwe, which I thought was really interesting. As recent as 2019, that Botswana and Zimbabwe have agreed to strengthen trade and investment and call for the lifting. This is really significant of Botswana doing this, call for the lifting of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe for the last 20 years. They've asked for them to go. And look at this, Botswana has agreed that Zimbabwe's diamonds will go to Botswana for processing, cleaning, polishing, and marketing. That is major. The Diamond Trading Company in the capital of Botswana, Gaborone, has facilities that are second to none in the world. So it's got excellent facilities to do this. So that means that if Zimbabwe can get its diamonds through Botswana, then it's more likely they can sell them at higher prices, and it could be a major source of foreign income to Zimbabwe. So it could be a great way of having kind of sanction lifting or sanction busting, as we might describe it as. So I see that as very progressive. Now, I promised you I'd look at the role of women. In every country, I try to do at least 1 or 2 slides on the role of women, because people, we often say, you can't judge any country until you can judge how high the women have risen. So this is quite interesting. They did ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, but they haven't ratified the protocol to the African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights on the rights of women in Africa. And I don't understand why. It doesn't really make sense why they haven't ratified it, but I can't see any major contradictions in Botswana around women, except for some tendencies for young marriage. But other than that, I haven't seen anything that stands out in terms of a major contradiction on women. Botswana women entrepreneurs are on the rise. It's high levels of entrepreneurship amongst women. The MasterCard Index on Women Entrepreneurs tracked the number of female business owners as a percentage of total business owners across 54 high, middle, and lower income countries. And look at that. Botswana ranks 2nd in the world for the number of women entrepreneurs. I think that's quite positive. That's a really good example. So it demonstrates that, you know, if that many women are in entrepreneurs, that means it's usually a symbol that women have a level of freedom to actually go into business. Because in very repressive countries where women are very repressed, how does a woman go into business? They haven't got money, they haven't got resources, they haven't got capital, and their men won't let them. So it's another way of indirectly demonstrating that women are probably relatively free in Botswana if they got the 2nd highest in the world of female entrepreneurship. Remember, this is in the world. This is out of all Western countries as well. So it's phenomenal. I think that's pretty good. And that 34, nearly 35% is very, very good. Okay. Improved percentages of senior roles of women hold. Look, it was as low as 8%. Yeah. Sorry, it was as 23% in 2016. And only in 1 year, it went up to 31%. So that was a significant. So that is really very good, because I don't believe there's even 31% in England of women in senior roles. So it's very good. A few more points on here. There has been a 6% reduction in the percentage of business with no women in senior leadership. So that's good. So let's put this another way. In other words, there are less businesses that have no senior women in. So that's a positive. Sometimes when you look at these stats, you get confused what it's actually telling us. So that's a positive. In other words, more senior women in business. But this is a but though, and this is where I will say there's a but. HIV and AIDS is still a problem in Botswana. So this is what makes me wonder, with the wealth they've got, there's still a little bit of an issue there. And I know South Africa had real problems with AIDS, HIV and AIDS, and it's right on the border of Botswana. But I would have thought Botswana would have been more sophisticated at dealing with it, but not too good. Because if you look at the prevalence of HIV and AIDS, it's much higher in women than it is in men. So look at that, 26% as opposed to 17% in men. So it's quite high. So women, you know, over a quarter of women with HIV and AIDS, that's a massive problem. So that's something that really needs addressing. The positive side is that access to drug treatment is free. But that's kind of like closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, isn't it? Because it's good that there's antiretroviral treatment, and it means that most women can live a normal life. But still, if you give birth, or sexual behavior means that you can transmit it to other men and other people. So it's still a big problem. You know, there's still a risk there. But at least they do give free antiviral. But it'd be interesting to know why that hasn't been addressed better than it has been. Let's look at income levels. Oh, sorry, this has been edited. Sorry, I should have taken this out. This is the old slide. Sorry about that. So let's look at healthcare in Botswana. It's ranked 84th out of 194 countries. So it's about middle, isn't it? A little bit higher than halfway. So it's a little bit on this, the higher half of the world, but not as high as you would have hoped, given how high it is in transparency and governance and all these other issues. I thought it was pretty low. If you look at a global health security index of 100, there are only 40. That's not that good. So that's what makes me just question a little bit. They got universal healthcare, but there's still outcomes are questionable. So there's just some issues there that just make me wonder. So yes, it's universal healthcare to all citizens through a public health system. So there is a little bit of private system, but most people are in the public sector. So 98% of all medical facilities owned by the government. So that's good. So that means there's universal healthcare for all its people. But as I said, it's a small population, so there should be anyway. But it's just questionable, those outcomes. The majority of people live within 5 kilometers of health facilities. So that's like within sort of 3 miles of health facilities. So even if you didn't have transport, it's virtually walkable, 3 miles, isn't it? Virtually walkable. Look at life expectancy. Whilst it's reasonable, it's not great. So life expectancy for men at 63 is pretty low. If you look at life expectancy in Britain, it's closer to 80. It's nearly 80 for men and over 80 for women. So whilst life expectancy is usually higher for women in most countries, 67 is still not really that high. So this is what I mean by still makes me wonder why it's still not higher than that. You know, it's higher than that in many countries around the world. And it's only ranked 55th in 193 countries for child mortality. So it's still an issue. It's much higher than Cuba, much higher than most Western countries. So as I said, I think there could be a lot more they could do to improve healthcare. And I mentioned high rates of HIV and AIDS and other infectious diseases. But we talked about in Ethiopia that a large percentage of the population don't have access to drinking water. Here, nearly the whole population has access to drinking water. But again, not surprising given this very small population and very large amount of land, that access to water is not going to be as problematic as 100 million people needing access to water. So that's a lot of water that you need to pump in and a lot of drains and so on. But it's still good. Okay, let's look at education. 88% literacy, which is good. And guess what? Literacy amongst women is higher than men, which is virtually never happens. So that also tells us something about how women and girls are treated it says Ethiopia. Sorry about this, being sloppy here. This is actually Botswana because I changed it today, but I should have put Botswana at the top, so I apologize for that. It is free for the first 10 years, and education is in the local language for the first 4 years, and then it's in English. Yeah, 87% of school-age children attend public schools. There is still a private school system, and interestingly, 3%, which is not massive, but it's still significant, are homeschooled. Yeah, girls and boys have equal access to education, but there's a but. It was mentioned that there is a likely dropout in secondary school due to pregnancy, which is not just teenage pregnancy. Didn't mention that, which might happen in somewhere like Britain. So that also gives a little bit of a worry that girls are still having, getting married off young, because, in a progressive society, you wouldn't expect or you wouldn't want children to be leaving school because they're getting pregnant. Yeah, even in Britain, there's a whole policies to try and prevent children getting pregnant or girls getting pregnant when they're still in school. Most people would consider a child under 16 is still a child, and having babies is not really positive. And in fact, it's illegal in most countries to have sex under 16 anyway. So there's an issue there as well. So coming a bit more towards a close, we can have a bit more time for discussion today. I thought I was well behind, but I think I've caught up anyway. So we're going to have a bit more time for discussion. Modern Botswana. This is just some pictures of modern Botswana. I think symbolically the center, somewhere around housing. I would have liked to have had more. I'd always like to have more time every week to do this work, to put more pictures and share with you more stuff around the country, just to show what it's like. So we finished.